May 3, 2007. Praia da Luz, Portugal. A beachfront tourist resort, families dining, children sleeping in their rooms, and a completely normal holiday routine. A few meters away, in a nearby restaurant, a group of adults alternates between conversations and glasses of wine. Every so often, one of them gets up, leaves the restaurant, walks toward the apartments, and checks on something that, at that moment, seems perfectly routine, that the children are still asleep. Among them is a 3-year-old girl. Her name is Madeleine McCann. Minutes later, one of those checks changes history forever. The apartment door is open. The bed is empty. And the girl is gone. There is no noise. There are no obvious signs of clear forced entry. There is no immediate explanation. Only an absence. In a matter of hours, the case stops being a family concern and becomes an international search. Portuguese police, British investigators, media from all over the world, and a question that still, nearly 2 decades later, remains without a clear answer. What happened that night inside that apartment? But to understand it, one must go back to the beginning. Before the silence. Before the search. Before the name of Madeleine McCann became one of the most well-known cases in the world. The story of Madeleine McCann begins the way many stories begin that should never end in an international investigation, with a family holiday. The McCann family travels in 2007 to the south of Portugal, to the area of Praia da Luz, a common tourist destination for British families. They stay at a holiday apartment complex known as the Ocean Club, a resort designed precisely for that: rest, beach, and tranquility. Sun, outdoor dining, swimming pools, and a sense of security typical of a gated tourist environment. Traveling with them are several family friends. It is not an isolated trip, but a group of adults with young children sharing the experience. During the day, the routine is simple: beach, pool, walks, and children's games. At night, the dynamic repeats with a fairly fixed structure. The adults dine at a restaurant within the complex itself, while the children remain in the apartments. The idea is simple. The restaurant is nearby, the parents return periodically to check that everything is fine. An informal organization that, at the time, did not seem particularly dangerous within the context of the resort. The apartments are distributed around the complex. Short paths, easy access, and a general sense of community among the guests. Madeleine is 3 years old and shares an apartment with her twin siblings, who are even younger. Her room is separated from the area where the adults gather to dine. That night of May 3, 2007, the pattern repeats. The adults dine, converse, and alternate periodic visits to the apartments to check that the children are still asleep. In appearance, everything goes normally. Nothing suggests that this night will be any different from the previous ones. However, at some point during that apparently controlled routine, something changes. A detail. A time interval. A moment without direct surveillance. And from then on, the story stops being a simple holiday scene. Because when one of the parents returns to the apartment, the door no longer tells the same story as before. This detail, which at first glance might seem minor or even the result of a misconception, becomes the first critical element of the case. When the interior is accessed, the scene changes. The bed where Madeleine was sleeping is empty. There are no clear signs of a struggle evident in the room. There is no noise. There is no answer. Only an immediate absence that is difficult to interpret at that moment. The initial reaction is not immediate in terms of understanding what has occurred. It is first a search within the complex itself. Of phone calls. Of rapid movements between apartments. Of confusion. And of a growing sense that something does not fit. As the minutes pass, the possibility of simply being lost within the grounds is ruled out. The complex is enclosed, controlled, and there are no clear indications that a 3-year-old girl could have wandered off alone without being seen. The concern quickly turns into alarm, and the alarm into a notification to the local authorities. The Portuguese police are alerted and, with that, the case stops being an internal situation of the tourist complex. From that moment on, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann enters the realm of an official investigation. But in those early hours, the only thing that exists is uncertainty. An open room. An empty bed. And a question that begins to repeat itself without a clear answer. Where is Madeleine? When it is confirmed that Madeleine McCann is not in her room, the situation stops being an internal search within a tourist complex. It becomes an emergency. In the first few minutes following the alert, the Ocean Club staff and family members begin moving all over the grounds in search of the girl. Apartments, common areas, and internal paths of the complex are checked, along with any place where she might have moved on her own. But the result is immediate and worrying. There is no clear trace of Madeleine within the visible area of the resort. The Portuguese police arrive at the scene and begin organizing the first phase of the search. At this point, time becomes a critical factor. Every minute counts, and every decision can influence the subsequent reconstruction of the facts. The search is expanded inside and around the complex. Access points are inspected, outdoor areas are reviewed, and an attempt is made to establish a timeline as precise as possible of the last time she was seen. But there is a fundamental problem from the very beginning. The initial information is fragmentary. The testimonies come from people who were dining, entering and leaving the restaurant, and conducting intermittent checks. This makes the exact reconstruction of the night complex from the start. Meanwhile, the news begins to spread within the tourist environment. Other guests are informed, and the atmosphere in the complex changes completely. What hours earlier was a holiday setting turns into an active search scene. The authorities begin to consider various possibilities, from an accidental exit from the complex to more complex scenarios. But at this point, there is no conclusive evidence pointing in a specific direction. The only clear thing is Madeleine's absence. With the passage of the first few hours, additional support is requested. The search expands beyond the resort. Local resources are mobilized, and an operation begins that is no longer just for the tourist complex, but regional in character. As the night progresses, uncertainty grows. And the time window between the last time Madeleine was seen with certainty and the moment her absence is detected becomes the central axis of all subsequent investigation. Because in that interval, still without a clear explanation, something occurred that would change the case forever. In a matter of hours, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann stops being a local matter in a tourist complex in the south of Portugal. It becomes international news. The British media begin covering the case intensively. Shortly after, the story crosses borders and appears on news broadcasts across Europe and other continents. The reason is evident. It is not just a disappearance, but a 3-year-old girl missing under circumstances yet to be clarified inside a closed holiday resort. The case gathers several elements that make it particularly media-heavy from the start. A minor, a holiday environment considered safe, the absence of immediate clear signs, and a very specific time window that is difficult to reconstruct with precision. As media attention grows, so does the pressure on the investigation. The Portuguese authorities face a case of great logistical and media complexity at the same time. At the scene, the search continues with expanded means. Increasingly wider areas around the complex are reviewed. Attempts are made to reconstruct the chronology of the previous night with greater precision, and testimonies are gathered from people who were at the resort. However, as the days pass, the first difficulties also appear. The initial information is not always consistent. Some details regarding schedules and movements do not completely match among witnesses, and the reconstruction of the facts begins to show small discrepancies. In parallel, the case begins to generate massive public attention. Madeleine's image is disseminated in media worldwide. Alerts are issued. Search campaigns are published, and her name becomes one of the most recognized internationally in a very short time. With the passage of days, the investigation expands even further. Different units intervene. New inspections are carried out at the complex, and wider hypotheses about what happened begin to be explored. But at this point, a clear conclusion still does not exist. Only a series of open possibilities, and an absence that remains without explanation. The case no longer belongs solely to one family or one country. It belongs to global attention. And that attention, over time, will also influence how the next steps of the investigation are interpreted. Because from this point forward, every new detail will be analyzed, questioned, and debated on an international scale. And the case of Madeleine McCann will enter its most complex phase. With the disappearance of Madeleine McCann already turned into an international case, the investigation enters a much more complex phase. British teams join the Portuguese authorities, including specialized units that begin collaborating on the reconstruction of the facts. The objective is clear: to define with precision what occurred in the time window between the last time Madeleine was seen with certainty and the moment her absence was detected. But that window, which in theory should be narrow, turns out in practice to be difficult to delimit with accuracy. The testimonies from that night come from multiple people who conducted intermittent checks in the apartments while dining at the nearby restaurant. This introduces a fundamental problem. The chronology is not perfectly linear. Small differences in memories, times, and perceptions generate variations in the initial reconstruction. As the investigation progresses, attempts are made to arrange that information into a coherent sequence. Schedules are reviewed. Statements are compared. And movements within the tourist complex are reconstructed as faithfully as possible. However, even with those efforts, the case retains zones of uncertainty. In parallel, different hypotheses about what happened begin to be explored. Some focus on a possible accidental exit from the complex. Others consider more complex scenarios involving the intervention of third parties. But in this phase, there is no conclusive public evidence that allows one theory to be affirmed over another. Meanwhile, media pressure continues to grow. Every new detail is analyzed by the international press, and the case begins to generate a level of attention that directly influences its development. The global dissemination of the case has a dual effect. On one hand, it increases the resources and visibility of the search. On the other, it introduces a level of constant scrutiny over every step of the investigation. In this context, the reconstruction of the facts becomes an increasingly delicate process, because it no longer matters only what happened, but also how it is publicly interpreted. As the days pass, the investigation expands even further beyond the tourist complex. Nearby areas are explored, potential exit routes are analyzed, and attempts are made to determine if Madeleine could have been moved out of the grounds at some point. But the case offers no immediate answers, only more questions, and a timeline that, despite all efforts, remains definitively open. The next step of the investigation will mark an important change in the direction of the case, because attention will begin to shift from the chronology of the night toward the potential people involved. And that is where the case of Madeleine McCann will enter a new phase. As the investigation advances, the case of Madeleine McCann begins to change in nature. What was initially a search focused on locating a missing girl progressively turns into an investigation into what happened inside the tourist complex that night. Attention shifts from "Where is Madeleine?" to "What happened in the critical time window?" At this point, investigators begin to analyze every available element in more detail. Testimonies, schedules, movements inside the Ocean Club, and potential entry or exit points of the grounds. The objective is to reconstruct not only the chronology but also to identify any anomaly in the sequence of events. With the passage of time, the investigation opens up different lines of work. Some focus on the possibility of an unsupervised exit from the apartment and the complex. Others explore scenarios in which a third person might have intervened during the night. However, it is important to note that in this phase, there is no definitive public conclusion that allows one hypothesis to be confirmed over another. What does occur is a progressive increase in the complexity of the case. The more data analyzed, the more difficult it becomes to establish a single, closed reconstruction of the facts. In parallel, media attention continues to grow, and with it, so does the pressure on the investigation. The case becomes one of the most followed in the world, and every new development is constantly interpreted, debated, and reanalyzed by public opinion. With the passage of months and years, the investigation continues to evolve. New information is reviewed, lines of work are reopened, and new teams and resources are incorporated at different moments. But despite the efforts, the core of the case remains without a definitive answer. Madeleine's disappearance remains unresolved in a conclusive manner within the public sphere. And that turns the case into an example of a prolonged investigation over time, where the available evidence has not allowed all unknowns to be completely closed. In this context, new figures and new approaches begin to emerge within the investigation, especially in later phases of the case. Some names are added to the list of investigative interest. And over time, one specific line will begin to stand out above the others within international police attention. But that part of the story belongs to a later phase of the case. A phase in which the investigation changes direction once again, and where time begins to play an even more important role. With the passage of time, the case of Madeleine McCann enters a different phase. It is no longer solely an active investigation in the initial sense, but a long-term case that is reviewed, updated, and reinterpreted as new information appears. The immediate search in Portugal gave way to a sustained international investigation over time, with the participation of different police forces and shifts in focus over the years. During this period, the case does not disappear from the public agenda. On the contrary, it remains present intermittently every time a new clue, a new testimony, or a new police analysis emerges. In later phases, a specific line of investigation begins to gain more relevance within the work of the German authorities. The focus shifts toward potential links with a suspect identified in European investigations related to other crimes. Christian Bruckner appears as a central figure in this stage of the case. It is important to point out that, in the public context of the investigation, his connection to Madeleine's disappearance has been treated as a line of investigation, not as a conviction or a definitive judicial conclusion. Throughout recent years, various authorities have indicated that he is considered a prime suspect in relation to the case, although the judicial process related to Madeleine has not reached a final public resolution. Meanwhile, the investigation remains active at different levels. The United Kingdom maintains open operations related to the case. Germany continues to explore its main line of investigation, and Portugal retains the original file within its judicial framework. The case, therefore, has not been closed universally, but rather remains distributed among different jurisdictions, each with its own approach. In parallel, media attention keeps reappearing whenever there are developments. Reports, official statements, and occasional updates reactivate global interest. However, despite the progress accumulated over nearly 2 decades, the core of the case still lacks a publicly confirmed definitive answer. A complete and closed reconstruction of what happened that night in Praia da Luz does not exist. And that lack of certainty is, in large part, what keeps the case alive in the collective memory. Because beyond the investigations, the documents, and the hypotheses, a question remains that has never stopped repeating itself since 2007. What exactly happened to Madeleine McCann? As the case of Madeleine McCann spread across the world, a parallel phenomenon occurred that would deeply mark the investigation and the public perception of the case. Not all clues were real. Not all faces were relevant. And not all sightings corresponded to the missing girl. In the months and years following 2007, reports of alleged Madeleines began to appear in various countries. Some people claimed to have seen a very similar girl accompanied by unknown adults. Others asserted they had recognized her in airports, on highways, or in public spaces. There were even cases of minors who, due to physical or circumstantial coincidence, were mistaken for her. Each of these reports was initially treated with caution by the authorities. Investigations were opened. Testimonies were gathered. And in some cases, DNA tests were conducted to rule out any relation. The result was always the same. It was not Madeleine. One of the key factors behind this phenomenon was the massive media exposure of the case. Madeleine's image was disseminated globally from the earliest days of the investigation. This turned her face into one of the most recognizable in the world in a very short time. But that visibility also had a side effect. Every blonde girl of a similar age could generate potential confusion. Every sighting, no matter how improbable, became a potential clue. Over time, the investigation had to filter through a huge amount of unconfirmed information. Reports in different countries, anonymous calls, and testimonies that, although often sincere, did not correspond to the reality of the case. This phenomenon did not resolve the disappearance, but it did complicate the investigation, diverting resources and attention in multiple directions for years. And it left a clear consequence on the case. The more famous the name of Madeleine McCann became, the harder it was to separate reality from confusion. Time has passed. The news has changed. The generations too. But the case of Madeleine McCann keeps appearing, time and again, in headlines, documentaries, and investigative updates. Not for lack of information, but for the absence of a definitive conclusion accepted universally. Because this is not just a case of disappearance. It is also a case of a prolonged investigation, of crossed lines, of incomplete reconstructions, and of a specific night that continues to be analyzed nearly 20 years later. At the center of everything, the same initial image remains. A tourist complex, a room, and an absence that changed a family's life forever. The rest is the continuous effort to try to understand what happened in that interval of time. And to accept that, even with all the accumulated information, there are stories that are not always completely resolved.